Now, I'd like to move seamlessly, if possible, to our next presenter. Speaking of highly cited scientists, Professor Bialystok is herself one of the most highly cited female scientists in the world, principally because of her work on the topic of the bilingual advantage, that is cognitive reserve and neural maintenance, which comes from speaking more than one language. So without further ado, I'll pass to Teresa to introduce Professor Bialystok to you.
Good morning there, and good evening here. Ellen Bialystok is a distinguished research professor of psychology and Walter Gordon Research Chair of Lifespan Cognitive Development at York University and Associate Scientist at the Rothman Research Institute of Baker Center for Geriatric Care. She's an officer of the Order of Canada and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Her research uses behavioral and neuroimaging methods to examine the effect of bilingualism on cognitive processes across the lifespan. Her discoveries include the identification of differences in the development of essential cognitive and language abilities for bilingual children, the use of different brain networks by monolingual and bilingual young adults performing simple conflict tests, and the postponement of symptoms of dementia in bilingual older adults. Among her awards are the Canadian Society for Brain Behavior and Cognitive Science Award, Killam Prize for the Social Science, York University President's Research Award of Merit, Donald Stuss Award for Research Excellence at the Baycrest Geriatric Center, and the Walter Gordon Research Fellowship. In 2017, she was granted an honorary doctorate from the University of Oslo for her contributions to research. And she's a very cited researcher and important researcher worldwide in the neuroscience of bilingualism and neuropsychology of bilingualism. Thank you so much for being here. You can share your screen with us, please.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I didn't know that they calculated citations separately for men and women. That's interesting. Thank you very much for inviting me to this really wonderful conference. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy to be following Professor Stern, because I have been hugely influenced by his work, as you will see. And why do I not have a show there? Got it. Okay, sorry. Okay, I have been greatly influenced by Professor Stern's work, and you'll see echoes of his talk in my work. So what I want to argue is that among the factors that he described, we can also consider experiences in using language across the lifespan. And because so much of what I'm going to say fits precisely with his conceptual framework that he set out, I think we could just call my talk What You Just Heard, and by the way, also Bilingualism. So you'll see it's a very compatible conception, but I'm going to try to make the case that among those factors that contribute to cognitive reserve, we also need to consider patterns of language use across the lifespan. Now, why would we do that? It seems somewhat random that a particular language experience should have these rather generalized impacts, not only on cognitive systems, but on cognitive reserve later in life. And the reason for that is because of the way two languages are represented and used in the mind of a bilingual. The surprising but massively confirmed finding is that in a bilingual mind, both languages are always active, even if you only think you're using one of them. So you constantly have a situation that selection and attention is required. There's no language switch. There's only the cognitive resources for attention to select the language you need to use right now. And what seems to be the case is that that selection of the language needed in this moment is carried out by domain general attention networks. And so the long experience of having to deal with this selection throughout life leads to what I like to call an adaptation in those attention networks. So adaptations are just changes. They're neither good nor bad. They're just reconfigurations that reflect an experience. The consequence of that adaptation in attention, because attention is always used in the bilingual mind, is that we get behavioral differences on tasks that directly require attention. If you're comparing monolinguals and bilinguals at different stages. There are very reliable structural and functional brain differences at every stage in the lifespan, beginning in early childhood. Just children, toddlers who are raised in environments where there are multiple languages spoken are developing different brain structure and functional associative networks. And what we're going to talk about today, it also has as a consequence a contribution to cognitive reserve in older age. So the way I think about cognitive reserve is that the signature is in an interaction between brain level and cognitive level. So we can see here that on the left panel, over age, brain structure and cognitive level typically decline, and they typically decline in parallel, such that you can predict one from the other. So for any given cognitive level, brain volume, and so on, you can reliably determine what cognitive level is associated with it. Cognitive reserve puts a wedge between that, such that as brain structure declines with normal aging, cognitive level shows this resilience you just heard about and remains higher than would be predicted. So what I want to argue is that bilingualism is one of the factors that contributes to putting a wedge between those processes and allows cognitive level to remain higher than the predicted value given a brain level. So what we're going to look at is whether bilingual experience protects cognition in the presence of neurodegeneration, because that would be an essential feature in order to conclude that there is, in fact, a contribution to cognitive reserve. So what kind of evidence would one need? Well, it turns out not to be a simple question at all, because the central terms are not simple. Now, in the research you've already heard, for example, the extent to which education contributes to cognitive reserve, it's very simple to calculate, quantify an individual's education level. And then you can use that calculation as an independent variable in some kind of equation that looks at cognitive outcomes. But in the case of bilingualism, the two central terms are not at all simple. Bilingualism is not a categorical variable. And the current research now in bilingualism in the last, I'd say, 5 years, has really zoomed in on trying to figure out what the features are that make someone bilingual or more bilingual or functionally bilingual, how to quantify them, and how they interact with other concepts. And it's complex, but what's emerging is this view of bilingualism as a multidimensional continuum. So you need to know what the details of the bilingual experience are, what age you became bilingual, how much you use each language, in what context they're used, what the environment supports, and so on. And from those details, you can create this multidimensional continuum. And that leaves bilingualism as a construct that's measured not in category, way that can be clearly segregated, but as a scale from experience that's defined as more monolingual to more bilingual. Similarly, what do we mean by protection? And here in the neuropathology literature, we can talk about protection against symptoms versus protection against disease. And you've heard some of this already in the previous talks. And this leads to different methodologies. If we want to know about symptoms, we could talk about retrospective studies. If we want to know about disease actually forming, we probably need to use prospective studies. And what's different about them is whether we're focusing primarily on cognitive evidence or on underlying brain structure. So again, we really have a continuum where we balance the information from cognitive symptomatic evidence that's kind of objective to more underlying brain structure that's more hidden. And this continuum of balance between cognitive and brain evidence together defines what we mean by protection. Now, in the research that I'm going to talk about, it's actually been simplified to a point that excludes most of the major fuzziness, which is reductionist in an unfortunate sense. So most of the research addressing this question, does bilingualism contribute to cognitive reserve, has focused on individuals who are very bilingual, very clearly high bilingual experience, and have used retrospective studies of cognitive measures to address symptoms. So as you can see, it's part of the picture, but it isn't the entire picture. Now, I've said a few times I've been highly influenced by Professor Stern's work, and you'll see now the whole rest of the talk is based on one of his amazing drawings. I think he does fantastic visual representations. And the one I'm going to use to organize all the rest of the talk is this one. So you saw this in his talk. And it's a figure that lays out the relation between accumulating neuropathology, some measure of cognitive level, and I like that these are nice and vague in this figure, and a hypothetical trajectory for a low reserve and a high reserve individual, given all else is equal. And we always have to assume all else is equal. And in the studies I'm going to show you, we assume education is equal, occupation is equal, age is equal, all those other factors that you've seen vary in the previous talks. So if bilingualism indeed contributes to cognitive reserve, then evidence from actual studies should fit into this figure, because this figure really lays out the groundwork for how we can recognize the effect of cognitive reserve. And it's a little different from the figure I showed you in that with in here, instead of increasing pathology, I was talking about increasing age, but that's correlated with pathology. So I can combine these by saying, what you see here as decline overall should show up in this graph as just a diagonal line that cuts right across the two reserve trajectories and shows this, this function. So we will come back to that. What I'm going to do is pick 4 features of that figure and evaluate the extent to which evidence from bilingualism fits the predictions made by that figure. So the first one is we're going to hold neuropathology constant. We're going to get people who are maybe on the cusp of older age. We have no reason to believe there's any neuropathology at all. And what should happen is that holding constant that neuropathology, which is still at a reasonably high level, cognitive test score should be higher for high reserve people than low reserve people. Again, all else being constant. So we've done a lot of this kind of research. We've compared cognitive function in healthy older adults using behavioral studies. We've used all the standard executive function studies. And typically, bilinguals outperform monolinguals on the executive function tasks, and sometimes more specifically, only on the high conflict conditions of those tasks. We've also used a recent probe task, which is the Sternberg proactive interference task. You see a sequence of slides, and you have to recognize whether the current slide whether the probe slide was in the current set or not. And you can make it complicated by introducing interference and inhibition and so forth. And basically, we find that bilinguals are in blue, monolinguals are in red. That's for all my slides, so you don't have to squint and read the legend. Bilinguals have greater facilitation and less interference on this kind of task. These are healthy older adults and young adults. And similarly, using that kind of analysis on a different version of the same task, we replicated bilinguals had less interference than monolinguals, although in this study it was an easier version, there were no differences in facilitation. So that's just one slide to dispense with this, cognitive performance in healthy older age. Typically, bilinguals do better on these tasks. But let's move along the scale a little bit. So we're still in healthy aging, but we're further along. These individuals are a little bit older, but none of these individuals have revealed explicit symptoms of cognitive decline. So they're functional older adults. And what we're going to say now is that we're going to hold the cognitive level constant. Okay, we're not matching on brain level now. We're holding the cognitive level constant and selecting cognitively functional older adults. And the prediction from this graph is that if we do that, and let's just pick a modest cognitive level, the high reserve individuals at that level will have more neuropathology, okay? So again, everybody is still well above the clinical cognitive level, but we've only taken this modest cognitive level that's typical of low reserve individuals. There's several studies that have looked at this using gray matter volume, but the results are mixed. For example, an early study by Jubin Abudalabi and his group showed that for this kind of match on cognitive level, look at gray matter volume. In their study, bilinguals had more gray matter volume than monolinguals. Two later studies, one that we did, Rosanna Olson was the first author, and another one by a group in the US, showed no difference. Gray matter volume was identical. And finally, in another study that we did, it's actually in revision, not in review, we did this study and found, wow, they're matched exactly on cognitive level, but the bilinguals had poorer gray matter volume by a lot. And I've included the figure because it's substantial. So this is the distribution of gray matter volume for monolinguals, and this for the bilinguals. It's a big difference, and they're all identical cognitively. So how do you integrate such wildly crazy results? They all matched on cognitive level. They all compared groups that were clearly monolingual or bilingual. How is this possible? The difference between the studies is the age. In the Abudalabi study, they were very young. They were just on the cusp of being older adults. In the two equivalent studies, they were a little older. And in our current study, they were older still. So what's going on? With increasing age, these relations are transforming, even though cognitive level is not changing. So there's an increasing brain disparity with increasing age for cognitively normal individuals. So you can take that out and hypothetically create a new graph that includes age as a dimension. So these are kind of hypothetical data that I've based on the real data I just showed you, where we can look at age as a factor and level on the y-axis. Now, level is going to refer to both cognitive level and brain level. Remember, I said at the beginning that I consider cognitive reserve to be an outcome of an interaction effect between cognitive level and brain level. So let's hypothetically hold cognitive level constant, because all of the studies that I told you about did that. So what we see is that for low reserve individuals, there's a decline over age in brain volume, as there is for high reserve individuals. But if we consider that high reserve individuals may also start with larger brains, perhaps brain reserve is part of that compendium of cognitive reserve. And there is decline, and it's pretty rapid, such that in early ages, the bilinguals have more gray matter volume. The lines eventually cross on their inevitable trajectory downward. So there's a point at which they're kind of the same. But if we continue going further out, we now have a reversal of direction. So you need to include that other feature to explain how bilingualism is impacting gray matter volume. It's not a one factor model. And here you can see this is very similar to this figure I showed you at the beginning. Cognitive level stays constant, and the brain level is declining with age. So that leaves you with the rather unpleasant idea that bilingualism is bad for your brain, because the decline of the gray matter volume in bilinguals was not only more rapid, but ended up in a much worse place. So do bilinguals just have poor brain structure? To test that, we took the healthy older adults from the Anderson study I showed you, where they were 75 years old and the bilinguals had worse brains. And instead of matching on cognitive level as we usually do, we went into the ADNI database and picked out monolinguals who were matched on brain structure, as well as on age, sex, education, and so on. So we're now taking those bilinguals who have cognition scores equivalent to the monolinguals, but significantly poorer brain scores, and we're matching them to monolinguals. So what we found is that we can match on all of these variables and create two groups. The propensity score matching system gave 32 in each group that were very, very closely matched. So we know that the bilinguals were all cognitively normal, because that was a criterion for participating in our study, and they scored equivalently to the monolinguals on all our cognitive tests. So we know they're all cognitively normal. Now what we're going to do is put those bilingual brains inside the heads of monolinguals, kind of swapping their brains. So these monolinguals have identical background to bilinguals, and now they have the same brains. How do they do? So 41% of those monolinguals with the same brains as bilinguals have clinical cognitive impairment. So what that's telling us is that the bilinguals who have these deteriorated brains are still coping. This is resilience. The insult to their brains has not yet impacted cognitive levels. Now, those monolinguals that we drew from the IPND study, they are excluded from the kind of cognitive research we do because typically we match on cognitive level. So those monolinguals with the more deteriorated brains would never make it into our cognitive studies. So you have to do it backwards, match on brains, and then see what happens. The next junction in that graph is when clinical AD is in fact detected. So we're going to look at the point at which a diagnosis is made that there is clinical impairment in cognitive ability. And the prediction from this figure is that at that point, the bilinguals, the high reserve group, for the same clinical level that crosses the threshold to diagnosis, are actually more impaired. They have more disease, they have more neuropathology. So the first slide I'm going to show you is just a summary. The first way we went about looking at this was just to see at what age monolinguals and bilinguals were when they were diagnosed with dementia. It's a rough measure. Almost none of the studies I'm going to show you on this slide include brain measures, but you'll see a pattern. So across a large number of studies now, the clinical diagnosis of dementia occurs at an older age, just an older age, in bilinguals than monolinguals. And here are some of the studies. There's a few more out there that I haven't incorporated yet, but this is the mean age of diagnosis. Again, monolinguals are in red and bilinguals are in blue. These studies are done, well, we did a bunch of them, but so did a lot of other people. They were done in different countries and different conditions and different clinics. And you can see there's a very clear pattern that bilinguals are older. Sometimes it's not significant. Here's an example. This was a smaller N. I mean, there tend to be, you know, the usual variation, but you can see clearly that the pattern is clear. Bilinguals tend to be older. But again, age is not neuropathology. So how can we take this general pattern and examine the actual claim of that graph that high reserve individuals will have more pathology for the same level of clinical impairment? We did an early study on this point. We found monolingual and bilingual AD patients, and we matched them, again, as precisely as we could on everything we could think of. And in this case, we matched them on chronological age. And that was because we didn't want age-related atrophy to bias the sample one way or the other. So they were all exactly the same age. They had their whole battery of neuropsych and clinical test scores. We matched them on that. So for the neurologist examining all of the patients who were in our study, they would appear to be equivalent. The difference is half of them were monolingual, lifetime monolinguals, half of them were lifetime bilinguals. Everything else was matched. And what we had, because that's what the clinic had, this is not ideal, but it's what the clinic had at the time. They had CT scans for these patients. Now, of course, you'd have MRI scans, would be much more detailed, but this was more than 10 years ago. The first thing we checked was general atrophy using standard measures in the literature. And we noted there were no differences in overall measures of brain atrophy. We then looked at hippocampal atrophy, especially in terms of 3 metrics that had been shown in previous studies to be related to Alzheimer's neuropathology, temporal horn width ratio and third ventricle ratio. So these are all indicators of Alzheimer's pathology. And in every case, bilinguals had more damage on these 3 measures. And I have to add, these were not small differences, they were enormous differences. And in one case, it was by a factor of 2, so twice as much pathology in the bilinguals, given everything else was equal. So this is taking that idea that bilinguals are a little older and boosting it with some evidence that they're older despite advancing neuropathology. So what we see here is that the bilinguals have higher cognitive level than predicted by disease severity. There's 2 other studies that have taken this question and approached it in a different way. Another indicator of Alzheimer's pathology is metabolic glucose uptake. So with advancing dementia, with advancing disease, this ability to metabolize sugar in the brain declines. So we know that it is impaired. It's another index, if you like, of advancing disease. So 2 studies have used PET, which is how you have to measure this, to compare monolingual and bilingual MCI and Alzheimer's patients who are, again, equivalent, matched on everything else, and comparing only glucose uptake. The first one is Cowell and a group, I can't remember where they are even, is a rather small study. They matched on everything, and they showed greater impairment in the bilingual group for equivalent cognitive level in MCI patients, and they found it throughout the brain, parietal lobe, frontal lobe, and cerebellum. So it was very distributed. A larger study by the Pirani group in Italy that essentially followed the same procedure, but only used Alzheimer's patients. And again, matched on Alzheimer's clinical levels as well as background levels. In this case, they didn't match on age. The bilinguals were older, but the impairment differences were substantial. So again, for the same level of clinical impairment, the bilinguals had substantially more advanced damage to the brain. And again, it's in glucose uptake, and it was distributed throughout the brain. Although here it seems to be more confined. Well, I don't know. I don't want to overinterpret their results. So it was distributed. All right, that's the 3rd point. Let's move on to the 4th point. And this is a point that Yakov made in his talk. After a diagnosis, the slope of the decline is steeper for high reserve individuals. And again, it's counterintuitive. You think you're going to just continue to have this protection, but you're not, because there is an endpoint and everybody is heading straight for that endpoint. So at some point in the trajectory, the curves have to bend. So the prediction is from this graph that once you've passed that clinical level and you have a diagnosis, the decline is going to be steeper for high reserve individuals. So the way we looked at it was to take the clinical level as MCI and not AD. Very difficult to test and evaluate AD patients on cognitive measures. So we're looking instead at a different way of examining the question. We know that once there is a clinical diagnosis of MCI, there is a standard rate at which those patients convert to AD, and it's roughly 10% a year. That's kind of the norm. There's various estimates out there, but this one is a well-respected and average rate. So the consequence then is that if the clinical symptoms of cognitive decline occur later in high reserve individuals, and they have more neuropathology at the point of diagnosis, the conversion from MCI to AD should be more rapid. They're further down that steeper part of the slope. So we found 158 MCI patients by just digging through clinic records. We just go back and say, at what point was this patient first diagnosed with MCI? And then follow the patient's history until the point that the consensus diagnosis of the clinical team switched from MCI to Alzheimer's. We had 83 monolinguals and 75 bilinguals. Toronto is extremely diverse. Just look at anything and half the group will be bilingual. We made sure they were equivalent on whatever we could manage. They were equivalent on age at the point they were diagnosed with MCI. They were equivalent on years of education. At the point of diagnosis, they had similar BNA and MoCA scores. So here's what we had. These are all matched. But when we look at the time to convert from the original MCI diagnosis to Alzheimer's disease, despite everything else being equivalent, the bilinguals converted faster. It was a shorter period. They were on a steeper slope. And you could say, well, that's not great. I mean, you're going to just decline faster. What's the point? The point is that despite that, the bilinguals have had more time to live independently with whatever level of neuropathology they already had. They all have neuropathology. The issue is, what can they do with it? And the bilinguals can maintain more normal functional cognitive levels for longer, until they can't. Now, these are retrospective studies, and they've shown that signature difference. Oh dear, okay. Sorry, this isn't the slide I expected, but let's just do it. I've shown you they have, if you match for neuropathology, you get, people before there's any reason to suspect decline, better cognitive level in bilinguals, better at a given level of cognitive function. There's more neuropathology in bilinguals, even though cognitive levels are still in the normal range, although probably no longer better than monolinguals. At the point of clinical impairment that is diagnosed, there's more pathology in bilinguals. And following that diagnosis, there is more rapid decline for bilinguals. These are all retrospective studies that have examined the evidence post hoc. So because it fairly well fits the predictions from Yakov's model, I'm going to say that what he was calling low reserve, I'm going to call monolingual, and what he was calling high reserve, I'm going to call bilingual for that kind of study. But what about prospective studies, which many consider to be a more stringent test? In these studies, you track disease in a healthy cohort. So you're in control of everything that's happening. And if you want to really imagine evaluating whether or not there's protection, this would be the way to do it, right? Well, as I've said, and you've seen in all these slides, bilinguals still get Alzheimer's disease. There's no construct in which high reserve people just are protected, they're immune. It's not a vaccination against Alzheimer's. What happens is they show symptoms later. So what is the evidence for protection in these more stringent prospective studies? Well, these studies actually have mixed results, and most of them don't come up with much evidence that bilinguals are at less risk for disease. Some of them are very small n. There's a study by the Swedish group, a cohort study, that said monolinguals and bilinguals succumb to Alzheimer's disease in their cohort at exactly the same rate. So there's no protection for bilinguals. But the number of bilinguals in their Alzheimer's sample at the end of the study was 10. And there was something like 200 monolinguals. So I'm not sure what you can make of numbers like that. Statistically, it wasn't different, but you have to look at the numbers as well. And of course, there are many other risk factors that might even overrule bilingualism. But I do want to show you this slide from one of Stern's studies that looked at this. This is the Zahodny study in 2014, where they looked at a number of risk factors, education and age and so on, and found that they were all protective except for bilingualism. But I do want to point out in their study, 20 years of study of the cohort. These are survival graphs, don't have dementia, don't have dementia, don't have dementia. And bilingualism was measured in terms of a self-report question. How well do you speak English? Because all of these people had Spanish as their first language. And what I want you to notice is that the order of these lines is absolutely intact. Very well, well, not at all. Order of decreasing proficiency in 2 languages, and that the gaps between these lines increases. So they report in the paper, it wasn't significant, but as I just said for the Swedish study, sometimes you have to look beyond the statistics and just look at the numbers. There is a pattern here. But Alzheimer's disease is a disease of aging. So even if there's no effect directly, there is a cumulative postponement that might come up with its own impact. So maybe cohort studies are looking at the wrong unit of analysis. Maybe we need something larger, something that takes aging in a larger domain and examines the impact of this experience. So instead of individuals, let's consider societies. I had always been asked when I gave talks like this, well, so does this mean that more bilingual societies have less Alzheimer's disease? And I would say, not possible. Everybody gets Alzheimer's disease. Anyway, how could you possibly do that study? Not possible to do it until somebody did it. And this is a group that Ray Klein headed. You'll see the citation coming up soon. So what they did is they identified 93 different countries that had different language use patterns. And they classified these countries by the mean number of languages spoken per person. Okay, so this is an overall estimate. It's a generalization. Now, because Alzheimer's is a disease of aging, it's hugely important how long people live. You got to live long enough to get it. So they disaggregated their data in terms of the life expectancy associated with each country. And the simplest prediction is that the higher the life expectancy, the more Alzheimer's disease you should expect. All right. So here are the data, and they're complicated. So I want you to just focus on this bit. These are the mean number of languages per person in the population that were estimated by the linguistic analysis. These are Alzheimer incidence rates, so higher is higher frequency. And the data are shown by countries that have a low, medium, or high life expectancy. So first look at, and now I've put this blue box around it because very few of the countries had 3, 4, or 5 mean languages per person, so they're just creating noise. 90% of the data fall inside this box. Only 10% are outside. So first look at countries with low life expectancy. That's the black line. They don't get Alzheimer's disease, and it doesn't matter how many languages they speak. They just don't live long enough. Medium, look at the red line. Medium lifespan countries that are essentially monolingual have an incidence about here. But if they're bilingual, all else being equal, significantly lower incidence. But the interesting action is in countries with a high life expectancy. So if the country has a high life expectancy and is essentially monolingual, think the United States, think many countries in Europe, they have a lot of Alzheimer's. But controlling for economic wealth and health systems and all the things that went into those assessments, just being a more bilingual country dropped the incidence of Alzheimer's disease substantially. So these are showing societal effects on disease incidence as a function of societal bilingualism. And because Alzheimer's disease is such an enormous public health issue, this is important. All right, so what does this all mean? Again, I see these issues in terms of interaction effects. It's in the relation between cognitive level and brain levels. And as such, cognitive reserve, and here I'm thinking in the data I showed you for bilinguals, could conceal the presence of dementia. A high reserve person could have all the neuropathology of dementia and not show symptoms. And that's important to know because that will speak to and impact what kinds of clinical implications or interventions one might want to take. If you suspect this person might have hidden neuropathology, it might lead to a different kind of treatment. So bilingualism as a contributor cognitive reserve. In my title, my subtitle, I say, let's look what it can do and what it can't do. So here's what it can do. Bilingualism can provide resilience. So neurodegeneration has less impact on cognition than we see in low reserve individuals. And I showed you that at each of the 4 checkpoints in that graph. What it cannot do it doesn't prevent neurodegeneration. It doesn't prevent the disease. So it's a complex situation in which you have a disease that may not be manifest. And that is an issue for clinical and a social consideration. And I thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bialystok, for this very insightful presentation. Our first questions will be from Adam Privitera. Adam, could you please unmute yourself? Who is also helping us to organize this conference and is studying bilingualism himself.
Very nice to meet you, Professor Bialystok. Amazing talk. It's very interesting meeting a person whose papers have almost completely filled my hard drive at this point. So it's a huge pleasure. I recently reread your 2012 paper in Child Development, where you explored the influence of language pair on verbal and nonverbal task performance. And I was curious if you think that the same non-significant relationship would exist if we looked at the influence of language similarity on dementia or other aging-related disorders.
Right, and this is an issue in the field that people seem to be pretty polarized on. So what we tried to argue in that paper is that, of course, it has effects on language outcomes. You know, why wouldn't it, right? But we found no evidence in children that it had effects on cognitive outcomes. In the aging and dementia literature, there's only a small handful of studies, and they go both ways. And the greatest proponent on the opposite view, the view that the relation between the languages matters very much, is Jubin Abudalabi, who did the study with Brendan, who I see on my screen right in front of me. So maybe Brendan should add something to this. But in that study, they compared patients who had very similar languages, Italian and German, they're both sort of Indo-European, with patients who had Chinese and something else, I can't remember what, and they found different levels of effect. So I think it's still an open question. I think the evidence on either side is not adequately conclusive. But let me add to it that since that time, and even since Jubin's important study on the issue, what we've learned about bilingualism, and I alluded to this, but very briefly, is that far more important than the specific languages is the ways in which languages are used and the contexts in which they are used. And again, Jubin is an author on these ideas, so I'm not separating myself from his work. But now in the more recent work, it doesn't matter what the languages are, it is the degree and extent to which they are used jointly, interactively, whether you're switching between them, the degree to which the context supports one or both of them. So these issues based on actual usage patterns, I think, are far more important, and ultimately, when we eventually get enough data, will outweigh the evidence on language typology.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Professor Weeks, would you like to comment now or later on this research?
Yeah, please ask questions.
Okay. So I have a question here. Do the benefits of bilingualism go away in the event a bilingual loses a language, perhaps due to immigration?
Loses a language, right. Yes, yes. There, again, it's a small amount of evidence. but these effects require constant use. And you can think about it like the effects of musical proficiency. If you don't keep playing that Rachmaninoff concerto, after a time, it's not going to sound the same. So these are experience-related effects. And like all experiences, they have to be continually renewed. So I think, yes, I think these are diminishing effects as the experience diminishes.
Mm-hmm. I have another question. How late is too late for a person to benefit from learning a second language?
Right. So first I have to say that if you start learning a second language at the age of 60, I think that's a great thing to do. And I encourage everybody to do it because it's really good for your brain, but it won't make you bilingual. So there's a difference, and there's really two effects going on here. One is the effect from the process of learning a language, and the other is the effect from experiential use of bilingualism. And although they're obviously related, they're not the same. So regarding the process of learning a language, everything that's hard for your brain is good for your brain, and learning the language is very hard. So it's an engaging, stimulating activity that has all kinds of benefits just because it's an engaging, stimulating activity. We even find that if we look at the cognitive effects and sometimes the brain effects, but more likely the cognitive effects of bilingualism, we see greater effects in the early stages of this language learning enterprise. And I think it's because in the early stages, you've got both things happening. You've got this benefit of just learning something that's hard, as well as the benefit of being bilingual. So over time, you only have the benefit of being bilingual, and this learning something hard goes away. So if you plug into this later in life, you could say, I want to do something good for my brain. I could start doing crossword puzzles, or I could learn to play Rachmaninoff concerti, or I could learn French. And all of those options will provide stimulation for your brain, and they'll be good for you. But if you choose to learn French, you're unlikely to ever really be bilingual. So there's separate facets of this experience.
Long life experience that will make the change. Do you find that language 1 and language 2 proficiency have separable influences on task performance?
Okay, that's a much more complex question than it appears. And the main reason is, unlike almost everybody else who works in this area, I reject the notion that there is such a thing as L1 and L2. You can't number them. You can't attribute L1 versus L2 with significance that's unique. The designations L1 and L2 came out of this very simple notion that everybody speaks a language, they learn it from birth, and then at some point they might add on another one, that's the L2, and we can follow them. But life is much messier than that. And in fact, you can learn languages at any time, to any degree of competence, and use them in any kind of situation. Consider, for example, a family of immigrants. So they come from their country, which we're going to call L1, just to have something to call it. And they settle in a new country where the parents have to learn an L2. And then they have some kids. So these kids are at home for the first few years, and they're just speaking that L1, whatever that is. But after a short time, they're off in school, they're playing soccer, and they become native-like in this other language, which is their L1. What if they learn it not when they're 5, but when they're 10 or 15? Does that matter? There's no clear way of saying L1 and L2 are different things. I think we have to embrace the full complexity and say people can have multiple languages in their repertoire, and at different points in their lives, one or the other will be dominant. And at every point in their lives, each will probably have rather specific and circumscribed contexts where they're more likely to be used. So that doesn't fit well with this kind of binary notion of a language being a first or a second language.
Okay, thank you so much. We don't have time for more questions. We are so honored to have you here, and I will pass now to Brandon for the final words of this amazing session. Thank you so much again.
Yes, thank you. I would like to wind up with thanks to the team, most particularly in Hong Kong. As you can see, I'm in London, and all of this has been possible thanks to the work and willingness of Maria Teresa and Adam and Murphy to stay up late in Hong Kong to do this amazing work. And I'm very grateful. They have to get up again early in the morning for tomorrow. So it's a grueling exercise, but I'm very appreciative of the effort they've put in. And of course, thank the speakers again, particularly the two latter speakers who have been so instrumental in raising our awareness of cognitive reserve and the way in which we can harness cognitive reserve to improve the quality of life, which will be the focus of tomorrow's event: well-being, quality of life, and policy issues. So please join us if you can. Otherwise, have a wonderful day in the North Coast of America, and I believe we'll have a chance to meet again at some time in the future. So once again, thank you so much, and many congratulations on your great work.